Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. It's great to be with you. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle in Washington.
And you had a great interview this week with someone from Vancouver, Zach.
That's right, Cillian Collins, and he's a senior architect with Perkins&Will Architects based in Vancouver. And he's also a certified Passive House designer with over 10 years of experience. And he's been doing all sorts of project types, including lots of Passive House projects, both in Canada and in Ireland. He's chair of the Passive House Canada Education Committee, and he's been playing a key role in curriculum development there, in teaching, and in advocating for the Passive House standard in Canada. And as you probably know, there's been lots of really exciting progress around that advocacy. So really important work. With Perkins&Will, he's involved in a number of Passive House projects at lots of different scales, including a really striking off-grid mass timber cabin that we discussed a little bit, as well as a large-scale university student housing project that we also talk about in the interview. So we spoke about his path to Passive House when he was still in Ireland and in Europe, and then we touched on some of the really cool work he's doing at Perkins&Will as an architect, and then he also shared what's on tap for this week's Passive House Canada Summit. So please enjoy. So welcome to the podcast, Cillian. This is really exciting to be able to talk with you. And I think the first time that you and I met was over a beer in a pub in Vancouver in the before times.
When that was allowed.
Yeah, exactly. So it's great to be able to reconnect, and I know you've been up to a lot of really wonderful work. So it'll be fun to hear about that and hear a little bit about the Passive House Canada Summit that's coming up this week. And but I wanted to start with just hearing a little bit about what was the first time that you encountered Passive House? How did you get involved in Passive House? You know, what impact has that had on the way that you practice?
Hi Zach. Thanks for having me, I guess, or inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoy all the work that Passive House Accelerator are doing. So my name is Cillian. I'm an architect based in Vancouver, working out of the Perkins&Will studio. As may or may not be obvious, I'm not Canadian. I'm Irish, so I was born, raised, and trained as an architect in Ireland, and worked for several years studied and worked in Dublin, and worked in Cork as well, and studied a little bit in Europe and France too. I first, I guess, encountered the Passive House standard back mid-2000s, I guess, around maybe 2006 or 7, where as a graduate architect, recently graduated from School of Architecture in Dublin, in University College Dublin, and we had a good school. It was a very good design focused college or program. Ireland was going through, or maybe at the tail end of, quite a booming economy, and that was reflected in quite a vibrant architectural scene. And a lot of Irish architects had returned to work in Ireland, and some of our tutors were like Grafton Architects, who won this year's Pritzker Prize, and O'Donnell and Toomey are always on the Sterling Prize shortlist. But I guess then when I graduated as a intern or graduate architect, and I started working in a small practice in Cork, you're then sort of left to figure out, like, building regulations and contracts. And, you come out of maybe architecture school with not having a very good understanding of some things that, are maybe a bit more fundamental. And my bosses at the time had set up their own practice, but they were quite experienced being partners in a larger practice and had a range of projects from large, schools and mixed-use developments to smaller single-family homes. And I was given the task of taking on the design of a single-family home and sort of interface a bit with the client and given the ball to run with. And the client's brief was sort of, they wanted a blend of modern design or modern architecture and sustainability. And they had somewhat vague notions of each, as is sometimes the case. Either they have like a vague idea what that means, or some things resonate with them, but they don't really have it's down maybe to the architect's role to help shepherd that process a little bit. I'd had the background, the training, and I was always interested in how buildings go together. So I was interested in sustainability generally. As I sort of did my research and sort of started to collate and put together like project sort of development and initial sketches and concept design, I encountered in some form the Passive House standard. At the time as well, Ireland was going through a bit of a renewal of Part L, which is the energy regulations that govern, or the building regulations that govern energy, that had just been updated a little bit. So there was a lot of talk about that, and I attended a couple of summits or conferences and talks about that. And I remember sitting in on a talk by Tomás O'Leary, who runs Passive House Academy, and a lot of people have encountered him, and he was just describing the standard and his first encountering with this, and how I think his anecdote is about a Swedish architect had been giving a similar talk about it, and how that project had survived in power outages of a number of weeks. The client had complained because it was a little bit chilly, it was like 18 degrees, but the power had been out and the HRV was off. So it was sort of through that, like through gathering little bits, and I started to sort of learn a little bit more about it, and attended like a night school in the local university. And then I had the opportunity to the EU had funding for research, like a paid, basically 2-week educational holiday to Germany, where I went to a carpenter sort of school and did and I went with a couple of university buddies, so it was a nice sort of fun trip as well as educational, and started to learn a little bit, got the full, and I'd done like the evening course in at home, and then I did the same basic course again, say the CPhD or the designer course. But this time, I guess, closer to the source. This was in southern Germany, so a nice part of the world. And I had actually gone there with, I had a particular question in my mind about like a window detail. I was trying to figure out how we're supposed to do this thermal bridge-free window detail, that the code was telling us to do it one way. Even if that had been updated a little bit, the builder was saying they do it this way, and now we're supposed to be building it in this thermal bridge-free way. And I guess in Ireland and the UK, the primary construction methodology is cavity masonry construction. So the window normally sits on the inner leaf, and that's, problematic from a thermal point of view. Now you have to sit it out in the middle of the insulation, but how do you hold that? There was one project I'd found in the UK, Denby Dale, I think, Passive House. It was very hard to get details, so I was trying to figure out what this should look like. And, as I guess a young architect, you're sort of trying to tell your boss what needs to change and the contractor what needs to change, and you need to be able to justify it. So it was really like, and I didn't necessarily learn the answer to that in Germany because they do primarily timber frame construction, but it started this exploration really focused on the overlap between design and performance and sort of how the details work out. We ended up having to have like a steel angle that sets the window out, and then because it's a steel angle, it has to be connected back to concrete, not CMU, so we had to put in a concrete beam in the base of the window, and it turned into this whole sort of thing that seemed quite overly complicated to do, the right thing, and you would think that people have been building buildings long enough that why wasn't typical practice already doing this, and why wasn't there a simpler way to do it? So I guess that was that was how I encountered it in that first project. I learned a lot. We had an external consultant who introduced me to PHPP, and I'd been trained or sort of was familiar with the envelope side of things, but the whole mechanical side of things was double Dutch. So learning about ventilation rates and all that was, how overheating was starting to be a problem. We had large west-facing windows that, we hadn't allowed for. So that was the start of it, I guess. And from there, I guess I still remember some of those first lessons.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, that's an interesting, that question you were asking about why there must be a simpler way to do this. Has that been, does that continue, has that been formative for you in terms of the way that you approach Passive House practice? Has that, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. And on some of our projects today, we're still dealing, window details. We get and we can talk a little bit about some of our current projects, but we're getting requests for substitutions on windows with different window details that, just don't meet the performance requirements. And being extra careful about our, more the upfront design work required, the, specification and, documenting it in the drawings. Like I remember in that first project, I copied an air tightness spec from another project and I didn't put in the right numbers, and I only caught it on a shop drawing, and it was a tender addendum, that had a cost or a discussion impact with the contractor. So I think a lot of those lessons transfer. I still remember them, I guess, and we're still dealing with the same sort of issues on projects today. And generally, and I guess there's a lot of talk, and in teaching, or just presenting on the Passive House project, there's a lot. Cost comes up a lot. What does it cost? And that's seen as a barrier. And I think some of that can maybe be alleviated by simple sort of design decisions up front.
Yeah, the theme of simplicity seems really, really important. So you mentioned your current projects, and I know you have a number of kind of hot things going on, and I just saw just stunning images of the solo project. So tell us about what you're working on.
Yeah, so based in Vancouver, the Perkins&Will Vancouver studio, we and when I guess came to Canada, it's probably about 8 years ago now at this stage. It's the only firm I've worked with, and I was sort of drawn to them by their I guess history, or sort of that overlap again between design and performance. They had a good legacy of sort of sustainable design and practice, and they put an investment in training in-house staff, doing in-house Passive House training, and that's sort of filtered throughout the projects. And now that training is manifesting itself in projects themselves. So we just recently certified a off-grid mass timber building as PHI low energy building. It is sitting sort of north of Whistler in British Columbia. It's sitting in a valley, so our solar gains are impacted by a mountain to the south. So that's why we're hitting the low energy number, not the full certification. But it really is, I guess, it's quite a unique prototype project. And again, it's that blend of design and performance. We had a very good team, core team and team leader who really sort of kept design excellence and performance at the fore. We'll be presenting about it at the summit next week. And then that's with the same clients then who do larger scale development. We have other projects with them, including a 6-story mass timber multifamily Passive House project, closer to home here in West Vancouver. And a proposed rezoning for a 35-story mass timber Passive House project as well. So some of those lessons hopefully will scale up. And it's the same, things change a little bit as you move from smaller scale to larger scale, but it's the same sort of criteria, I guess, that the projects will be viewed through. And then we also just received our design stage assurance letter on the University of Victoria student housing. So that's quite a large project by the University of Victoria, which came to us with a mandate from the province of BC to go beyond LEED Gold, but they hadn't sort of fully defined what that meant. So again, we sort of helped shepherd that process. They were looking to expand, their campus, create more beds and more student capacity, but at the same time, they had a carbon emission profile that in, say, 10 years, they would be not able to meet their targets set out by the province. So it's this conflict of growing but reducing their footprint. So that's sort of where the Passive House standard came in. So we're doing an 8-story and an 11-story building for them. It's about 800 beds. There's a large commercial kitchen. We've again, a very good team on that here. A number of people. There's probably easily 20 people that have been involved internally, and then we have a good consultant team. And we often work with the same consultants in terms of envelope and mechanical, and our Passive House consultant as well. And then, so we're pleased to get the design stage review letter on that from PHI to sort of say that, the design at least has passed, a significant milestone. Because there's a lot of particularly larger projects. There's so many ways that you can leave the path, or you can sort of, it either gets value engineered out, or, there's no one, I don't think there's any one decision to people say, when did you decide to do a Passive House project? It's more like you have to continue and make the right decision along the way. But there is one decision that means you won't make it. So I think at least the design, that DSAR letter we got is an important milestone for us, and it sets us up in heading into construction. That'll also be featured at the summit next week. And there's a good story there about carbon, or at least a lot of work in resilience and future climate files, and sort of planning for the future. What way the climate's going to be at 2050 and 2080.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that. That's I think, and is kind of tangentially, is that also mass timber or a different?
That's a combination, I guess. It's primarily, I guess, it's a tower and podium type building. So the tower is, relative tower is 8 and 11 stories. It's concrete frame, and then the podium, sort of wider base, is mass timber, CLT. It was before, I guess, there's been more recent relaxations on how tall you can build in CLT or mass timber. But this is sort of more of a hybrid approach, I guess.
Yeah.
And we did some embodied carbon calculations, I guess, in each of those projects as well, to show, to capture both the operation and embodied sort of stories and measures.
Yeah. So clearly there are provincial guidance for the campus, and then probably, I imagine, some kind of university-based goals around emissions, I would guess. So let's dive a little bit into that carbon story, and kind of what you tell us about the operational carbon implications of the project, the embodied carbon, achievements,
The main, I guess, the main sort of much of the design work has. The project itself, as the buildings get larger, I guess it's the same. The principles are the same. So good insulation, air tightness, and all that. As we've worked through this project, a lot of the work has been on the primary energy side. A lot of discussions. We have a large commercial kitchen that produces about 9,000 meals a day. So that has, I think it's one of the largest that PHI have dealt with. So we and our Passive House certifier, Marine, who's very good at RTH, has been working closely with them. But we have a lot of discussions between us, the Passive House consultant, the mechanical engineer, about how many kilowatts to do this and that, that the architect normally wouldn't get involved with,
Sure.
What needs hot water, what doesn't need hot water, which sometimes can be a little bit frustrating. And it seems like, why are we into this nitty gritty detail? But ultimately it's dramatically driven down, a kitchen requirement. Say our target from PHI was a kilowatt hour number per meal. And so we had to get into, is it a hot meal? Is it a cold meal?
Yeah.
Is it cooked? Is it in this building? Is it in that building? This really it's not like, architecture, so to speak, but it's really diving into the details and more on occupancy schedule side. But sort of discussions like that have driven the overall performance of the kitchen down dramatically. Discussions with the client about, changing from gas appliances to electric appliances, induction cooktops. There was discussion with the chef team and the kitchen team and the kitchen consultant. The university themselves have a district energy system that's based on natural gas, and, the passive house standard, particularly the PER targets, are driving you towards an electric, heat pump solution, which is a capital cost to put in a infrastructure for heating and cooling and ventilation, etc. in the building, when there's already, say, a ready-made heating system there, but it's based on fossil fuels. So there's a little bit of a discussion with the client about what's the right thing to do. Do we plug into the existing built infrastructure that could eventually be changed to electric, or do we go for this better, higher performance thing? So that's there's just been a lot of discussions along the way, and I think our sort of on our end, our project architect and project leads have sort of shepherded the client through that process, and the client as well has been quite focused and willing to sort of accept. They obviously have a certain budget that they need to work with, so it sort of comes down to a decision on is this is this the right measure to make from a carbon point of view? Is it, what's the cost impact, etc. And apart from that, I mean, the larger buildings you're focused a little bit more on those PR and cooling numbers. But it's the same. We have to make sure we're doing a bit more front load work on the design side, on the envelope, doing our detailing earlier, making sure our architect specs tie in or cover off all the performance aspects. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so how central to the conversation in terms of the client's perspective has the embodied carbon been? What's that part of the story?
It has been a focus, and we've done, we do, I guess being maybe a larger firm, we do have the benefit of having resources and time to put into research. So we have a dedicated research team, and they have done a lot of work on embodied carbon, and that has fed it, that's fed into decisions on UVic. It can be as simple as, some of the structural elements that weigh in on, have quite a big impact.
Right.
A lot of it is just studying and developing a baseline for different building types to see, what are, what's the current baseline, what's achievable, what's the impact of, as we specify, say, concrete with a different mix, and how, that has a better embodied carbon footprint. And then, you realize, talking to the contractor, that has a different curing time, and that, they start working into the night on that. And the client is wondering, why is there noise, late at night? It's sort of that, it's a continuing education sort of, and embodied carbon, I guess, is a little bit harder to get your head around than the operation side. An operation side is very much defined within the passive house guidelines and principles, and the sort of numbers to hit, and you just, you have a bit of freedom in, if you want to make a design move or if a thermal bridge, you just mitigate it somewhere else, or you try to, so you change your glazing spec or you change your HRB or something. Whereas embodied carbon, it's, it's a little bit more of an involved story, and the baseline is sort of not fully defined yet. And, there's such an impact on material sourcing and sort of, how it's put in place, and sort of it's a bit of a trickier one, I guess. So I think it's a bit more of a nascent or earlier stage process, but we've just released a good embodied carbon primer to help educate our clients on the subject. So it's definitely more involved in the discussion. And in Vancouver, it's it's part of the new zero emission for new buildings pathway for rezonings. You have to do life cycle analysis, and they will probably be bringing in a requirement on mass timber as well as part of that.
So is that primer available for folks to?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well,
should be available. I can pass you on a link.
Okay. We'll share that in show notes. That's great. And one of the things that I've been hearing at times is this, I think, assumption by folks that achieving passive house performance and the major gains in reduction of operational carbon necessarily requires trade-offs on embodied carbon. What was your experience? What has been your experience in these projects that you've just been mentioning that are where you're tackling both? Has that been a major challenge?
I think there is overlap, I guess, that you sort of, I guess you would maybe take a little bit of different approach in tackling both, but something like, say, form factor or decision on like the overall form of the building is going to have an immediate impact, and generally it's trending in the same direction. More compact is better from a operation side, and it's better from an embodied side.
Right.
And generally it's something that maybe it's increasingly talked about now, but particularly on larger buildings, developers will talk about window to wall ratio. There's a push for them to have a higher window to wall ratio versus, the drive from energy performance to be a lower window to wall ratio. But that's intrinsically tied to how compact or not the building is. A low window to wall ratio on a poor or in a very articulated building is still, not going to be great.
Right.
Then generally, I guess we have quite again, as part of our research sort of endeavors previously, done a lot of work on healthy materials, both from there's increased focus now on embodied carbon, but also on just human health and toxicity and VOCs. So we have like a red list in terms of specifying what materials we allow to be specified in your building. And within the construction industry, it's hard to avoid or completely mitigate that. And something, whether it's to do with structure or fire or something else, there's certain materials that sort of have to be used. But we generally will use above grade insulation would be mineral wool, as opposed to maybe a poor performing from an embodied point of view, petroleum based. And there are detractors of how mineral wool is fabricated, but it's still it's still going to give you a better GHG emission profile than XPS or EPS or something, and just behaves better generally from a building science point of view. The structure, I guess, is 50% of your embodied carbon profile, and your envelope is about 25%. So the decisions you make on the envelope, it can be a trade-off. More insulation is better from an operation side of view. Less insulation is just better from an embodied, and holistic footprint point of view. You sort of, I guess, generally have to tackle both at the same time. I think it's more, and it's the same with the passive house targets and certification. It's not necessarily the be all and end all for every project, and there can be pushback from, even internally from on the architecture side. Why are we so constrained or designing to this arbitrary number when I want to do X, Y, and Z? But it's just having, I guess, the fluency or the language or the understanding of what the impact is when you make that decision, and then you can go ahead and make the decision we're going to make anyway, but it's not being made in ignorance,
right.
And then the result is the performance gap where buildings are, not performing as designed and contributing, in a great part to global climate emissions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's pivot to this week's summit with Passive House Canada. You alluded to it a couple times in the conversation in terms of these really cool projects being featured at the summit. But tell us about the summit and what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, so I'm also involved a little bit with Passive House Canada. I volunteer and also teach with them. And when I first arrived in Canada, it was just a way to meet people. And I think that's what generally keeps people involved with Passive House. There's a professional sort of development side, but also there's a good community, and people are generally enthusiastic and sort of top of their game. So it's an engaged sort of network that you're dealing with. The summit this year is, I guess, the response, or it's generally would be the national conference. Otherwise, that was due to be held in Victoria. It usually moves from geographic location. Last year was in Toronto. And this year, obviously, it's been held virtually. It's 3 half days next week. There's a good lineup of scheduled events. So some of our talks I mentioned, some other both smaller and large scale talks, like say locally HCMA Architects have just completed Clayton Heights. It's a large community centre. I think they're talking about that. There's some Part 9, which is under the Canadian Code, single family or smaller buildings. Multifamily or affordable housing from Ontario, and some retrofit housing, and then more policy and topical discussions. Like I know you and Graham are hosting a talk on wildfires and the impact of those on indoor air quality. There's a talk about COVID and healthy materials. So generally, it's hopefully curated to be quite a good. And I know people are inundated with options for Zoom calls and learning and all that these days, but hopefully it'll be a worthwhile event for people to attend.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it. I think that probably most people who are listening to the podcast are aware of the leadership, kind of global leadership that the city of Vancouver and the community of practitioners in British Columbia have taken around Passive House. And this is a great opportunity for a global community now that it's virtual, right? Anybody can attend, to take advantage of the knowledge that has been amassed in your neck of the woods. It's really exciting.
Yeah. And we have someone from Elron who used to work in the UK and has his Passive House blog. Will be speaking on his work and the efforts in New Zealand as well. So it has a bit of a wider reach. And I think I know some of your presentations coming from the States and Australia. So yeah, it is that opportunity. It's the same with our online teaching classes. You're no longer sort of constrained to your area. You know, we now can reach people all over Canada. So that's a good side, I guess, of the. You miss out on the in-person face-to-face, which, you know.
Well, hopefully in a few months.
Yeah.
Once we get through this crew, I'm in the US, so we have some tough months ahead of us right now, but the light
seems to be on the right track.
Yeah, the light is we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Well, this has been really fantastic, Cillian. Is there anything else that you want to add before we close it up?
No, I think it's a pleasure to chat with you and keep doing what you're doing. I always enjoy listening to when either the interviews or joining the global happy hours. So it's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks, Cillian. It's really exciting to watch your work and the progress that you're making, and so good deal. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
No problem. I will send you the embodied carbon primer, and also we'll probably have a little video on Sioux Valley that might be worth people might be interested in seeing as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you. So that was Cillian Collins. What are your thoughts, Matthew? What did you think?
Great. I love the Irish accent for a start.
Yeah, no doubt.
So many good things to take out of that interview. One of the things was about was transferring that experience. First of all, what a fantastic opportunity to go and spend 2 weeks in Germany and learn on the ground. I think we should do more of that. I see it in other professions where there's sort of a you go off and study overseas, or you spend a bit of time learning in a different environment. It's such a valuable thing to do because it avoids having to reinvent the wheel completely. But what did happen is that he had to translate some of what he learnt in Germany, where they were building with timber frames, back to, for example, how to install windows into masonry buildings in a similar way. And his big question to the industry is, why is there not an easy way of doing that in the local context?
That's right. And I think that, maybe that's maybe a core activity, core challenge, core like lifelong thing that good architects do, I think, is to search out for, find a simpler solution. And we know when we see elegant, simple solutions in design, there's the the kind of the aesthetic satisfaction that brings, but it also means in passive house contexts, lower cost usually, and simpler installation. So that I think that it's probably a lifelong frustration with complexity that drives good architects.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways passive house is complicated because we're dealing with some pretty interesting science. You get down into the details of psi values and even xi values, and we love that stuff as engineers. But the best passive houses are simple in form. They're simple shapes, they're simple structures, and there is beauty in that simplicity as well. And that's the challenge, like you say, of the architect is to bring that complexity into a simple form, but also to make it look aesthetically pleasing, which he does an exceptional job of in that cabin that you referred to, which you just showed me those images, and we'll put those links up somewhere so people can see them. That is simply a stunning building, and it is a relatively simple form.
Yeah, it really is, and I think that that was that theme came up again when we were talking about embodied carbon and how the simplifying form and not having a lot of articulation is an important piece of passive house design. It also reduces the embodied carbon in buildings because the structure is usually I think that Cillian mentioned that they're saying that 50% of the embodied carbon footprint of buildings comes from the structure. So it was, it's always satisfying to see the kind of synergy, I guess, in like that, and the kind of parallel how simplicity is important in both arenas.
Yeah. I would be interested to hear from our listeners and people in general about embodied carbon and if it's something that people are taking into consideration, because Cillian kind of alluded to the fact that there's nothing requiring that necessarily, and it's almost something that you take on that responsibility, and it's easy to deal with operational carbon, and that's something that we talk about with energy, and we can model for that. But there are more and more tools out there for looking at life cycle analysis and thinking about where products and materials come from. We do need to look at that and the embodied carbon of materials if we do want to have a holistic approach to everything from the design, the construction and procurement, and then also end of life of buildings as well. The good news is that, like I say, there are more tools available for that, and there are avenues for doing that. But it is certainly an important piece of the puzzle and something that we're starting to grapple with on this side of the planet as well. Something else that Cillian talked about that we're all dealing with is overheating. And the interesting thing there is that while there are differences in the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere when we talk about south versus north facing glazing, the common thread is west facing glazing. And that's something that catches a lot of people out, is that's often the source of overheating, because you get that afternoon sun coming in, and it's not just the low angle sun that you get different seasons, but it's also that afternoon sun that comes in all through the shoulder seasons, and quite often in the hotter seasons as well. When the sun in the middle of the day is overhead, you still get that sun coming in at a low angle. My thoughts on that are that good passive house design does account for, or can account for, overheating. What often tricks people up is when they are adding insulation, when we add a lot of extra insulation, when we make our buildings more airtight, because that's what we think is the right thing to do, but when don't allow for things like external shading or adequate ventilation to actually deal with those additional solar gains that we might be getting.
Yeah, and in Seattle and much of the Northwest, many buildings are oriented to the west, especially if you're close to the water. You're wanting. There are a lot of shoreline that's facing.
Nice view.
You want to capture those views and capture the sunshine, and after long cloudy winters, we especially want to capture that during the summertime. But yeah, it can really bake. So it's that and having an eye towards solar management is I think really super important.
Yeah.
And
There's
I think
probably
it.
more
I
of a
mean, I think I think that's becoming more widely understood among practitioners for sure.
Absolutely. I think there is a little bit of a way to go. I think there's more work to be done in things like PHPP to account for that on a more complete way. But it is in there, and we do know how to do it. It's one of those things that does get often discussed at conferences and meetups.
Yeah. And in multifamily buildings too. I think that has also been something I think that's evolved, and understanding that's evolved over time is that with buildings with lots of people in them, then the potential for overheating can be higher. So there's that important evolution in our practice around that.
Speaking of conferences, part of the reason why we wanted to have Cillian on this episode is that this coming out on Monday, as of Tuesday, the 8th of December, will be the Passive House Summit, which is going to be a great event. You want to tell us a bit about that event, Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was great to hear from Cillian about some of what's going on. But so this is in place of what would have been the national conference, the in-person conference. So this is the signature national conference for Passive House Canada. And the theme this year is building resilience. So, they're going to be looking at what Passive House can do for, the role that Passive House has already played in Canada, what's coming in the future. There are also going to be pieces about things like wildfire smoke and indoor air quality. Actually, the Passive House Accelerator will be has been involved in helping to organize that panel discussion that'll happen on Thursday, and that'll be moderated by Graham Irwin. There's stuff about toxicity and embodied carbon, and then and policy, and that I think all the people around the world can draw really great lessons from the policy success that's happened in Vancouver, in British Columbia, and now in Toronto, and even at the federal level. There's just it's one of those very rich, lots of diverse programming kind of events that we all get to take advantage of, thanks to this online reality we're living.
That's right. It was, as you said at the end of that chat, it's become more global as we've come online. In fact, I was just listening today how in trade and in other ways that the world has become a little bit more nationalist and a little less global this year physically. But I think there are examples, and Passive House Accelerator is one of those, where we've actually become more global virtually because we've used online platforms to connect with each other. And these conferences are also a really great example of that it is now a global summit and is accessible to people from everywhere. And in fact, one of the last speakers on that program is Elrond Burrell, who's the chair of Passive House New Zealand. And they'll be talking about the recent work that Elrond has been involved in here, which is to do with building for climate change. Right.
I've read through some of the policy documents that he's been involved in. It looks really great. And sometimes not mentioning the name Passive House, but boy, those metrics look really familiar.
They do look pretty familiar. And the other thing that might be familiar is the pathway towards that future goal of looking, in that case, towards 2030 and then 2050 beyond that. He'll be in that conversation with Rob Bernhardt, and a lot of I guess a lot of credit should go and does go to the Energy Step Code of Vancouver. Yeah. We point to that all the time as a great role model for other energy codes and building standards. So it's great to see that example being used and adapting something similar, a similar framework to other regulations internationally.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be a good week. So definitely check that out. With loads of great speakers, a lot of speakers actually past guests of this podcast, and other. I know we've got the RDH team there as well, who are great supporters of Passive House Accelerator as well. So it's just going to be a great event. So definitely head along and catch some of that if you can. Have you got any other events coming up on top of that?
Well, in fact, we do, and both are the Passive House Accelerator Construction Tech, which happens on Tuesdays, and the Global Passive House Happy Hour, which happens on Wednesdays. Both of those events this week are going to be connected to the Passive House Canada Summit. So on Tuesday for the construction tech, we're having Marcel Studer from the Econ Group come and talk about his work building Passive House in British Columbia. And then on Wednesday, we have Chris Higgins from the city of Vancouver, who is one of the movers and shakers behind so much of the progress that's been going on around Passive House and climate mitigation policy, and the explosion of Passive House development that's happening in the city of Vancouver. It's so amazing. So he's going to be talking about also the city of Vancouver has done a bunch of made some really important commitments around their climate emergency plan that was just adopted recently. So he's going to be talking about that progress, as well as sharing some key insights from the summit on Wednesday at the happy hour. So that'll be cool. And then on Monday, December 14th, we're having our second Passive House Prefab Summit. And it's going to be sponsored by Vapro Shield this time. We'll have 6 new speakers from different manufacturers of Passive House Prefab take part in this, and showing off the processes and how it's done, and looking at prefab from all sorts of different angles. So we'll share information about how to register for all these free events that I just mentioned. And then, of course, there's lots of educational programming and other gatherings happening that we'll share in the show notes. It's even though it's December, there's lots going on.
There is lots going on. In there, you mentioned climate emergency, and I'll just have to do a quick shout out for the New Zealand government, who took the step of declaring a national climate emergency this week.
Right.
We are by no means the first country, and in fact, I think we might be behind about 33 or 32 other countries had already done that, and a few actual councils, city councils within New Zealand had already declared a national emergency. Now, I posted this week on LinkedIn that architects, designers, builders, we have at least 40% of the solution for that climate emergency and the response to that. Now, I was corrected by some of my colleagues that in New Zealand, it's actually statistically a little bit less than that. It's more like 20%, but that's only because we're very fortunate that historically we have a lot of our generation comes from hydro. Mm-hmm. We also have now a bit of wind. So on the generation side, we kind of hide behind some quote unquote renewable energy. But globally, us in this profession and with the knowledge that we have about Passive House, I firmly believe that we do hold at least 40% of the solution for climate emergency, which is a massive opportunity for us and also a responsibility as well. So I might just close on that note and just remind everyone that we do have a big responsibility, but also a fantastic opportunity ahead of us in the industry that we're in.
So true. Well said.
Well, thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Love to get your thoughts, feedback. You can contact us, podcast@passivehouseaccelerator.com. We'd love to hear from you. And do join us each week, as Zach said, on the Passive House Accelerator Global Happy Hour and all those fantastic opportunities to connect, and a lot of free events as well. So thank you, Zach, and thank you to our sponsors.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. The Passive House podcast and all of the programs of Passive House Accelerator are made possible by generous support from our sponsors. So I want to say thank you to them. Our founding sponsors are Baxter Architects, Mitsubishi Electric Trane HVAC US, RDH Building Science, StoCorp, and Zola Windows. And our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. Thank you.